Greetings and salutations, dear listener, and welcome to the newly relaunched Indiscretions podcast. By way of introduction, let me just give you a little bit of my background on myself and on the website, because I know we've picked up some new readership of late. My name is Catherine Emily, and I am the founder of The Politics of Discretion, a website which is primarily me ranting about my political gripes. I'm also the co-founder of Input Output Enterprises, which is the publishing house that owns Politics of Discretion, and that is a jointly owned venture between myself and my dear friend and business partner, Brett Salter. And both of these enterprises are driven by a commitment to individualist principles, and that's the primary perspective that we advance in everything that we publish, as you'll see if you explore either site, and I certainly hope that you do. But I won't go on at length about that here, because you can go explore it on your own time if you're interested, instead of listening to me ramble. And much of my own personal philosophy, which is the philosophy of discretionism, is on the website as well, and some of that will bleed through, but if you want a really more detailed look at it, then certainly please go online and do so. This podcast will hopefully be a weekly endeavor. We're going to do a video version, which will be available on YouTube, and there will also be just an audio version if you prefer that, which is available on SoundCloud and will eventually be available on iTunes as soon as we deal with that housekeeping. And this is largely just going to be a conversation about the political events of the week, assuming, of course, that there are any going on. I really don't care for the palace intrigue and the scandal mongering. What I do love talking about is substantive policy issues, and specifically their ideological underpinnings. But as you're probably aware, there's not a whole lot of that going on these days, so barring any interesting news events, we'll get into political theory, all of which will ultimately be from an individualistic perspective. So today, as a nice, gentle ease in, I guess I'll start by talking about exactly what I mean when I talk about individualism and the individual as a sovereign or an inviolable entity. Now, I have no idea what any of you are thinking about as you're sitting wherever you are listening or watching me. And you only know what I'm thinking about because I'm sitting here explaining it to you. We can't intuit the thoughts of others just by looking at them. There are no hive minds, there are no oversouls. And even when someone does explain their thought process to you, we filter what they're saying through the lens of our own personal experience. If you agree with something that someone else says, it's because you've done your own analytical homework and you've come up with your own conclusion about whether the statement is true or false. The same thing holds true to if you watch a story on the news and see a victim of a crime and feel badly for them. It's because you either know the magnitude of their suffering from personal experience, or you imagine yourself in a similar situation and imagine the kind of suffering you would endure, and you project your own memory of unpleasantness into that situation. We literally cannot step outside of ourselves. Even the things we divine from the depths of our imagination are contrast against what we've seen and experienced in the world. Your perspective, even if you find someone with whom you agree on 99.5% of the issues, is unique, because the process by which you arrive at your conclusions, even if you share those conclusions with others, the way in which you synthesize whatever values you happen to derive, that comes from the application of reason by your mind, which is shaped by a whole bunch of variables which are completely unique to your own life experience, to your background, to your character, to your talents, to things like that. And that idea really needs to be recognized anytime we start talking about politics, because individual sovereignty comes from the fact that you are, by nature, an individual, and your perspective is entirely unique. No one else can truly understand what you're thinking, even if you explain it to them. So they can't truly know your own interests. You're the only entity who can know and effectively represent your own interests. You're the only person who can make a determination about what's in your own good, regardless of whether or not you choose to pursue your own good, or regardless of whether or not you choose to disregard that and make bad decisions. It is by nature of individual creation that man is sovereign and hold rights that are inviolable. The uniqueness of the individual, which comes down to the rational process, is what makes rights inalienable to that individual and to that individual alone. And it's also the nature of the individual that makes rights reciprocal. I value freedom of conscience because I believe property is the most fundamental of rights. Heck, without ownership, you can't even have rights. And the most fundamental form of property is conscience, the right to think freely, to be master of my internal self, and the right to act on the dictates of my rational processes. That to me is the most important right that there is. And because I value that right so much, I need to respect it in others, even if I fundamentally disagree with the way that others exercise that right. Now, putting this into practice a little bit, I'm an atheist because I'm an individualist and I believe that I own my own life. And let's say I have a friend, as I do, who is a Christian. And because I love my freedom of conscience, I have to respect the right of Christians to exercise their conscience, even though I think the Christian ethic is inherently damaging to the individual. But any actions that I take to suppress the rights of Christians, even though I think that's in their own good, is also damaging to my own right of conscience, because I'm setting a precedent by eroding the rights of others that can ultimately come back and be used against myself. Love of my own freedom demands that I respect the same right in others. Freedom is reflexive. This is ancillary to the idea of individualism. Even acts seemingly done towards others are ultimately done with consideration of one's own good in mind. So I respect the rights of others because I want to make sure that my rights are inviolable. This ought to mean that a government that is friendly towards individualism can't make judgments about or for people. It can't take up the standard of aid for marginalized constituency groups. Welfare cannot be outsourced. Even if one person tells another what's in their best interest, the person who then goes and acts on behalf of the needy party is reacting to their perception, which is filtered through their own lens of personal experience of the other's need. They're not actually reacting to the need of the other. They're reacting to their perception of it. Government then can't actually represent any of its citizens. It can be a proxy, but in reality what it's doing is acting in its own interests because it benefits government actors to please the citizenry, because it helps them maintain their hold on power and to keep the country stable. And any time we're introducing that motivation into the equation, you have to take into account the value judgments of the other actor. Why are they helping? Are they gaining something from it? And the answer to that is always going to be yes, because there's no such thing as altruism. You can't divorce yourself from yourself. If you come to the aid of another, it's because you believe it to be the right thing and you derive some sort of satisfaction from acting in a manner you think is virtuous. And that's fine in the private world of personal transactions where people can give to charities that they support. But if a relationship there goes south, if the charity does something that you don't like, you can walk away, no harm, no foul. But you can't walk away from government. And once you give the government the opportunity to make judgments about who is in need and who is deserving of federal protection, not only do you violate the idea of equal protection under the law because some constituents are going to be judged more in need of government aid and protection than others, but you also open up the possibility that because government is responding to its own judgments, that it's going to become self-aware in other ways. It's going to gain other aspects of the individualistic nature. And that means that it's going to start thinking and feeling for itself and applying those judgments in less innocuous ways than well-intentioned social welfare programs. It's going to start looking to its own need. And because force is always on the side of the government, it's going to emerge the victor anytime there's any kind of conflicts between its welfare and the welfare of the citizenry. So government can't make value judgments. Government can't claim to represent people, not if it wants to be a government that claims to be representative of individuals and not representative of individuals, but to respect the sovereignty of individuals and the citizenry. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction into the basic tenets of the politics of individualism and what I mean when I talk about that. Now let's take those principles and apply them to current events and to what is being called as the purge on Facebook, who is once again being accused of suppressing political speech that it doesn't like. This time it's mainly libertarian and police accountability pages that have been shut down. Now, according to a story from Reason.com, Facebook, of course, claims to have had legitimate grounds for doing so. I'm quoting from the news story. Facebook accused the 100 of pages it purged of distributing spam, though the social media company used a curious definition of the word. Instead of flooding unwilling recipients with unsolicited ads, the company said the targeted organizations posted clickbait posts on these pages to drive people to websites that are entirely separate from Facebook and seem legitimate but are actually ad farms. End quote. Some personal pages were hit too, though some of these were later reinstated, and of course the page administrators disagree with Facebook's motives and claim that this is suppression of speech. And it may be. I don't have enough information to make a judgment about that either way. But here's the thing. Facebook is a private company, and even if what they're doing is purging libertarians from the site, because it's a private company, it has every right to apply whatever standards of conduct it wants to its own platform. Because regardless of whether or not what they're doing is good business or whether it's bad business because it's driving away their customer base, it has a right to follow its own conscience. And I say that as someone who is sympathetic to the libertarian viewpoint and who doesn't agree at all with what they're doing. But the reflexivity of rights principle is at play here. I don't like what Facebook did. I don't like it when libertarians are targeted. I think suppressing speech is wrong, though that's not actually what this is, because your rights don't extend to the property of others. That's a form of slavery, and compelling others to subsidize your belief is actually slavery. But nevertheless, I think that what they're doing is wrong. I think everyone benefits from airing viewpoints of all opinions. The rational life requires being aware of the nature of the world in which we live, no matter how pleasant that may be, no matter how vile certain actors in it may be. Better to know the true nature of a thing so that you can avoid it and purge it from your life. You don't want to end up accidentally supporting or subsidizing someone whose values are actually antithetical to your own. But let's be clear. Even though I think this is wrong, I think that Facebook is totally in the right to ban whatever accounts it wants. It's a private company, and it has a right to set the terms on which its creation can be used by others. And what's particularly disturbing about the way some on the right, not necessarily libertarians, but more traditional conservatives, are reacting to some of the banning that Facebook is doing is by calling for a federal regulation, by saying that this is unfair and that it is violating free speech rights. It isn't, but that's what they're saying. And the solution, if you're upset with Facebook, if we're following the reflexivity of rights principle, is not regulation. If we regulate Facebook because we don't like their treatment of right-wing groups, we set a precedent that can be used to undermine other groups in the future. Remember, the government used the fairness doctrine to effectively neuter right-wing talk radio for quite a long time. The course of action here that's in keeping with the individualist principle is to simply not use Facebook. Create an alternative social media platform. Join an alternative social media platform. Don't try and suppress Facebook's rights. Go out and instead exercise your own rights. Use your purchasing power as an extension of your freedom of conscience, because ultimately that's what it is. Support companies whose values align with yours and help cement your philosophy. But leave Facebook free to follow the dictates of its own conscience. And that doesn't mean don't be critical. Absolutely, we can speak out about what they're doing and say that it's hypocritical, because it really is. Facebook fully embraces the line of thought that places them at the forefront of the space of public debate, and claims that it is a crucial tool to democracy. But then they kowtow out to outrage mobs and sacrifice dissenting voices, which, while actually in keeping with the idea of democracy in action, is contrary to the idea of the free exchange of ideas. But you can't really attack them you can attack them on that philosophical principle, but you can't attack them on their actual actions. Because if you attack them on the idea of their philosophical hypocrisy of claiming to be for freedom of speech while taking actions that point out that that's not what they're really for, what you're doing is making a good, solid case where you can point to the fact that they are absolutely contradicting themselves. They are absolutely in the wrong. But if you make your argument viewpoint more subjective, you're not going to win over those who are hostile to libertarianism, because they benefit from what Facebook is doing. You're not going to win over those who believe in social justice. Again, they benefit. It's too subjective. It's too viewpoint dependent. So instead, make the criticism on a principle that has universal resonance. Because when rational individuals can apply their analytical processes and determine whether or not that's true, that's a much more solid case. It's a much more absolute case. It's much more difficult for Facebook to stand up to that. If you make the case that, well, what you're doing is unfair to libertarians, then someone else can turn around and say, yeah, but it's fair to us from our perspective. And then you end up engaging in a tribalistic argument that doesn't really get anyone anywhere and doesn't actually advance ideas in society. And that is the thing about individualism. It's not necessarily about the personal, which seems like a bit of a paradox, but a lot of the time it means advocating for policies that you don't necessarily agree with. But it's more important to create a government that is grounded in a philosophical framework that is respective of the sovereignty of the individual than it is to get your way in policy debates. Because policy changes, and regardless of who emerges victorious in one particular policy battle, if you contribute to a political culture that looks to support particular values, you're undermining your own rights in the long run anyway. Eventually the tides are going to turn and your values aren't necessarily going to be the ones codified into new laws. And then you're going to be unhappy. Consider how this has played out with the recent Supreme Court nomination. Harry Reid nuked the filibuster and in order to get Obama-era appointees through, because it was beneficial to him at the time, and now Democrats are really unhappy because the tide has turned and Republicans are in power and are using that to more easily get through nominees that Democrats find unpalatable. Ultimately, getting rid of that protection was not in their long-term interest. It's not necessarily about short-term personal victories. It is about making sure that we are sticking to principles, because that ultimately is going to benefit the individual in the long term. And anyway, in a world respective of individualism, government should be much more limited. Its actions are guided by the need to restrict itself and not others, to make sure its policies respect the rights of its own constituents. And that opens up the area in which you are free to determine and to pursue your own interests and to be an advocate for yourself. Government can't do that. Only you can. And that's why it's important to advance the ideas of individualism and not necessarily any narrower political ideology. Certainly, individuals have their own personal ideology, they have their own sets of values, and they look to advance those in their own lives, but what they don't necessarily do is look to make those the values that govern other people's lives, because in doing so, you're actually violating the sovereignty of those other individuals, and eventually that can be turned around and used against you. Okay, so let's wrap up for today because that's a lot to chew on. Thanks so much for reading, watching, listening, and supporting us. If you haven't already, please like and follow us on social media. We are The Politics of Discretion on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and excitingly, Liberdon, which is a great new decentralized social media site. It's a Mastodon instance for libertarians. I actually had a very fruitful idea-based exchange with someone on there the other day, so I highly recommend it as a social media source, and we will do our best to, if you interact with us on social media, to get back to you, to have an exchange of ideas. And when I say we, I mean me. I do run all of the social media for The Politics of Discretion, so please engage with us if there's something you want to see more of. Give us feedback. We always love to hear from you. I'm Catherine Emily for The Politics of Discretion. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, happy musings.